They told us it was just dirt, dark soil beneath African feet, worthless, forgotten. But when Traoré placed that small rock on the table in front of Prime Minister Modi, the world went quiet. That rock was not dirt. It was power. The kind of power that can build empires or bring them to their knees. Rare earth. The minerals that run every missile, every smartphone, every satellite, every electric vehicle. And for the first time, Africa said, "You don't get this, unless we say so." So ask yourself, if Africa holds the keys to the 21st century, who's really in control now? Hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear might change how you see Africa and the future of power. This rock just changed the balance of power. They say history turns on great battles, but sometimes it turns on rocks. Not the kind you find in museums, the kind buried beneath African soil. 17 elements. Names most Americans have never heard: neodymium, dysprosium, europium, but without them, your fighter jets do not fly, your phones do not ring, your missiles do not move. And for decades, there was only one gatekeeper to this invisible power: China. It was a quiet monopoly, built slowly, deliberately, through African soil and Chinese factories. When the West needed rare earth minerals, they paid Beijing. When Africa wanted more than crumbs, they were told to stay in their place. But in July 2025, something changed. The handshake was quiet. The deal, unexpected. The consequences, seismic. Burkina Faso signed a $42 billion rare earth partnership with India, not just to dig the minerals, but to refine them, manufacture them, and own them. It was more than a contract. It was a declaration. We will no longer sell the bones of our land to build someone else's empire. India pledged $15 billion to build advanced rare earth processing facilities across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, training local engineers, transferring guarded Chinese technologies, and breaking the myth that Africans can dig but not build. Another $10 billion will construct magnet manufacturing plants, the very magnets that power wind turbines, electric vehicles, and military systems. $8 billion more goes to electronics factories, circuit boards, capacitors, and components made in Africa, not just extracted from it. $5 billion will fund research universities and technical training centers, where the next generation of African scientists will no longer need visas to Beijing or Paris to learn the chemistry of power. And perhaps most shocking of all, $4 billion is reserved for defense-grade rare earth production. Materials for satellites, radars, and precision-guided weapons, made not in China, but in Dori, in Bobo Dioulasso, in Ouagadougou. Let that sink in. For the first time in modern history, an African country isn't just selling what's under the ground, it's building what goes above it. And this didn't happen through foreign aid. It happened through strategic negotiation, led by a man the West once dismissed as a rebel soldier. But here is the question. If Africa can process its own minerals, manufacture its own technology, and train its own scientists, then what role does the West play in tomorrow's world? That question is now echoing through Washington, Paris, London, and, yes, Beijing. Because suddenly, the global supply chain no longer runs through Shanghai, it runs through West Africa. Suddenly, African minerals are not just raw exports, they are geopolitical leverage. And suddenly, those who once dictated the price are being forced to negotiate. So now, I ask you, if the ground beneath Africa holds the future, who will write the rules? Stay with us, because in the next chapter, the monopoly ends and the reckoning begins. Why China went silent. After this deal, they say silence is golden. But in geopolitics, silence is lethal. When Burkina Faso announced its $42 billion rare earth deal with India, the headlines were quiet. Too quiet. No fiery op-eds from Washington, no condemnations from Beijing, no alarms in Brussels. Just silence. But underneath that silence, something was shifting, and the people who truly understood power felt it immediately. Because in the great game of global control, silence is never absence. It is calculation. Beijing knew it first. For over 30 years, China had locked the world into its rare earth empire. They didn't own the most minerals. Africa did. But they owned the refining, the technology, and the supply chain. Every missile, every smartphone, every EV battery on the planet, all of them passed through the bottleneck of Chinese control. And now, that bottleneck had cracked. Burkina Faso's deal wasn't just about extraction. It was about independence, about taking the minerals, refining them in Africa, training engineers in Africa, and building factories on African soil. That is what made Beijing go silent. Because if Africa learns to do what China has monopolized for decades, the entire global game changes. Beijing didn't release a statement, but they didn't need to. State-owned companies began emergency audits. Diplomats quietly reached out to Ouagadougou. Back-channel negotiations were offered and rejected. Washington's silence was different. It wasn't panic. It was confusion. Because for decades, the U.S. treated Africa as background noise, aid, not industry, crisis, not capacity. But now, a nation they never expected, Burkina Faso, had just rewritten the rules of rare earth geopolitics, and they weren't invited to the table. The Pentagon scrambled. Think tanks rushed out policy briefs. Meetings were scheduled, too late, because Traoré was already 2 moves ahead. Europe, too, hesitated. They offered green partnerships. They spoke of sustainable development, but their tone carried an old arrogance. Traoré didn't reject them. He simply made it clear, Africa is not the quarry. It is the factory. And that silence from the West? It wasn't diplomacy. It was shock, because they never expected Africa to say no. They never expected Africa to say, we'll build it ourselves. This wasn't rebellion. It was revelation. For the first time, African minerals would no longer power someone else's economy. They would power Africa's own. And now, the world has a choice: buy rare earth from China and live under its political leverage, or buy from Africa and accept a new kind of partnership, a partnership where Africa sets the price, builds the refineries, trains the chemists, and yes, controls the rules. It is not war, but it is power, and it's the kind of power the old world order is not ready to share. But ready or not, the shift has begun. So, here's the question you won't hear on the news. If the next generation of American weapons, phones, and green energy depends on minerals from Africa, what happens when Africa finally says, "Now you need us"? Are we prepared to listen? The real revolution isn't in the mines. Not all revolutions begin with guns. Some begin with textbooks. In the village of Dori, where dusty winds once carried only silence, now there's construction noise. A rare earth processing plant is rising. Next to it, a school, not just any school, but a technical college teaching magnetics, metallurgy, and mineral chemistry. Children who once memorized colonial borders are now solving equations about neodymium separation. Mothers who once waited for foreign aid now attend business classes, learning how to run logistics companies that will serve the new industrial corridor. This is the revolution no one saw coming. Because while headlines scream about money and minerals, the real shift is human. It is Salif, a teenager from Fanangurma, who no longer dreams of escaping to Europe. He wants to become an engineer, not in Paris, but in Ouagadougou. It is Aisha, a grandmother who now sees her village lit by steady electricity, powered not by imports, but by the revenue from the mineral beneath her own feet. This is no longer a story of charity. It is a story of capacity. For decades, the West gave Africa development assistance, hospitals, roads, food, but always with conditions, human rights clauses, political compliance, a promise to remain non-aligned while quietly aligned with someone else's agenda. But now, the hospitals are being built not with aid, but with profit. The roads, not by UN contractors, but by African firms. The decisions, not by foreign consultants, but by local councils. That's what this $42 billion deal represents. Not just rare earth minerals, but rare political independence. For the first time in decades, countries like Burkina Faso are not being told what they should do. They are asking what they can build, on their terms, with their partners. Of course, there are challenges: managing environmental risks, preventing corruption, balancing rapid growth with cultural identity. But those are problems of builders, not beggars. And that alone is progress. Internationally, this deal has changed the calculus. ECOWAS, often fragmented, now sees Burkina Faso not as a liability, but a strategic leader. Neighbors like Mali and Niger are exploring shared infrastructure. African Union committees are proposing continent-wide rare earth standards written by Africans, for Africans. Even the African diaspora is taking notice. Young professionals in New York, London, and Paris are asking, should we go back? Should we help build? And perhaps most profoundly, African citizens are seeing, many for the first time, that value doesn't have to be extracted. It can be created. At home. By their hands. This is not the kind of news that dominates cable TV, but it's the kind that changes lives for generations. And here's the quiet truth no one admits: when people have power, not just electricity, but influence, dignity, choice, they do not need to flee. They stay, they build, they lead. So I leave you with this. What if the future African migrants we feared were actually the engineers we needed all along? And if stories like this resonate with you, take a moment to share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next chapter of this story is already being written. When the world no longer looks to Washington. At first, Washington tried to downplay it. Just another bilateral agreement. Nothing new, nothing threatening. But behind closed doors, the mood was different. Very different. Pentagon briefings began to mention Burkina Faso, a name that had not crossed their desks in years. The Department of Energy issued quiet warnings about rare earth vulnerabilities. And defense contractors, they started asking hard questions about supply, security, sovereignty, because for the first time, the world's most powerful military saw a gap it could not easily close. Rare earth minerals power more than phones. They power missiles, drones, cyber defense systems. And now, a portion of that power had shifted to a country that does not take marching orders from the West. This wasn't about ideology, it was about logistics. If Burkina Faso, and potentially other African nations, processed their own minerals outside Chinese control, outside American oversight, then the U.S. supply chain would face its first truly non-aligned bottleneck. The usual playbook didn't work. There was no dictator to denounce, No war to intervene in, no IMF leverage to pull, just a sovereign deal between equals on African terms. And that made Washington nervous. Europe fared no better. Their green energy goals depend on magnets, batteries, advanced electronics, all requiring rare earths. They had bet on China, and now they were caught between two emerging giants, a confident India and a newly assertive Africa. French analysts quietly question whether their former colonies had outgrown them. German officials asked if European companies were too slow, too cautious to seize new partnerships. For decades, the West assumed control meant protection. But this deal proved something else. Sometimes, not being in control means not being needed. And perhaps that is what stung the most. The world is not waiting for Washington anymore, nor for Paris. It is negotiating without them, planning without them, building without them. That's not a threat. That's reality. The only question now is, will the West adjust or be left behind? Because while they hesitate, others act. India secures materials for its growing industries. Africa builds its first generation of mineral-based manufacturers, and countries like Brazil, Indonesia, and Vietnam are watching. The world is not becoming anti-West. It's becoming post-West, a landscape of new alliances where value is not extracted, but negotiated. And in that world, trust is the new currency. So, I leave you with this. If Washington no longer sets the rules, who do you trust to write the next ones? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. And if you haven't yet, subscribe for more stories the headlines miss. Africa isn't waiting anymore. Close your eyes. Picture the year 2045 across the Sahel. Factories hum with precision. From Ouagadougou to Niamey, solar panels gleam atop research institutes. The Made in Africa label appears on electric cars in Berlin, on magnets in Bangalore, on satellite components in Houston. But this isn't fiction. It's a roadmap. And it started with one signature, one deal, one belief. Africa can build. The road ahead is not smooth. There will be sabotage, external and internal. There will be corruption, incompetence, pressure to sell out again. But this time, the people are watching, and more importantly, they're participating. Communities are no longer begging for development. They're negotiating contracts. They're managing logistics hubs. They're sending their children not to flee, but to study engineering, metallurgy, law. Governments, too, are learning. That sovereignty doesn't come from speeches. It comes from control over value creation, and that's what makes this different. Burkina Faso isn't exporting rebellion. It's exporting a model of industrial self-respect, a model of partnership without subjugation, a model where African minerals no longer flow out raw, but return as wealth, tangible, shareable, ownable. In a world racing toward renewable energy, artificial intelligence, and defense innovation, rare earths are no longer a commodity. They're a chokehold or a lifeline, and the continent that controls them has leverage it never dared to claim until now. So the question isn't whether Africa is rising. It already has. The question is, will the world adjust, collaborate, or compete? Because one thing is clear, Africa isn't waiting anymore, and neither should you. So if this vision resonates with you, join the conversation, leave a comment, subscribe, because what happens next is not just Africa's story, it's ours. The next superpower isn't who you think history doesn't whisper, it echoes. For centuries, Africa was written into the margins of global power, a continent described by what it lacked, not what it held, lacking development, lacking technology, lacking leadership. But what if that story was always wrong? What if the minerals under African feet were not a curse, but a countdown? Because when the world needed speed, Africa had silence. When the world needed precision, Africa had patience. And now, when the world needs rare earths, Africa has everything. In a boardroom in Silicon Valley, a CEO hesitates. Their supply chain depends on magnets they can no longer trace. In Brussels, a policymaker panics. Their Green Deal hinges on materials now refined in Ouagadougou, and in Washington, a general flips through a dossier labeled Strategic Dependencies Africa. This is not science fiction. This is strategy catching up with geography, because Africa never lacked resources. It lacked permission from the world and from itself to lead. But no more. With India, with new industrial partners, with its own youth at the helm, Africa is not rising. Africa is building. Africa is bargaining. Africa is becoming not just a supplier, but a superpower, maybe not in tanks or nukes, but in the magnets that guide missiles, in the processors that power intelligence, in the batteries that fuel the future. If you're watching this from the West, ask yourself, is our military independence now dependent on African cooperation? And if you're watching this from Africa, what are you going to build with the minerals beneath your feet? The next superpower won't be decided by missiles or metals. It will be decided by who owns the machines that make the modern world run. And, for once, the world will turn, not toward Washington, not toward Beijing, but toward Ouagadougou. This is not just a story. This is a moment. And if you feel it too, share this video, drop your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe, because this time, Africa writes the headline.